right, so this is going to be Galileo Galilei, chapters 9 and 10. This is an old comprehension check, so don't worry about that. On trial, chapter 9. So we know that Galileo was being forced to travel to Rome to be put on trial for the charge of heresy. So let's see how that went. Galileo was 70 years old when he stood on trial in Rome. Remember, he also was not of great health, so it was a pretty tough time for him. The trial would last for 10 weeks, with Galileo standing before the court for only 4 days. The judges charged Galileo with writing a book that supported Copernicus. They claimed that Galileo had deliberately disobeyed church orders that were given to him. They dug up their notes from when Galileo came to Rome in 1616. The notes stated that Galileo was warned not to hold, teach, or defend the Copernican system in any way whatsoever. Now, if you remember and think back a little bit, you remember that in the previous chapters, we read that the Pope told Galileo he could write about the Copernican theory. He just could not say that it was a proven theory. He had to be careful to state that it was an unproven idea. So Galileo was a little bit rattled by this. He was like, hold on, I don't remember anyone telling me that. So Galileo was rattled. Their warning went much farther than what he remembered the cardinal telling him. He brought forth his own piece of evidence, a letter that the cardinal sent him, which Galileo thought stated he could write about the Copernican theory. So he basically kind of presented his own evidence, and he fought hard for his innocence. Okay, you remember he was a devout Catholic. He wasn't trying to go against the Catholic Church. He was more just wanting to search for the truth. So eventually, when he realized kind of how much trouble he was in, he kind of started to back off a little bit. So here's a picture of what I guess some artists would think the trial looked like. I would assume this guy on the right here with paper in his hand, I would assume that is Galileo, probably trying to present his evidence and defend himself. And then either these guys or the guys here on the left or up here in the balcony looking kind of thing, I would assume those are the Inquisition judges. So this would be Galileo standing before the court at his trial. On day 2 of questioning, however, Galileo stepped forward to apologize. Why? What had changed his stance from being so defensive to just kind of accepting and apologizing? Sorry, I keep yawning. He realized the circumstances he was in. He was old and frail. Remember, he wasn't of great health ever since the whole poisonous gas incident in his basement. And the church was not going to change their mind. He was in trouble. Finally, on day 3, the Inquisition pronounced him guilty. The Inquisition would allow Galileo to escape the penalties only if he stated that the Copernican theory was wrong. So, remember, if you remember from the Reformation unit and previous studies, normally the charge and the consequence for heresy was death, usually death by torture. So the Inquisition said, you know what, Galileo, we'll kind of lessen the penalties a little bit. Basically, we're not going to kill you, but you will have to admit that the Copernican theory is actually wrong, which we know for Galileo, this was kind of a tough decision. Yes, he was a devout Catholic. No, he didn't want to die, obviously. But he also did not want to lie about something that he knew was true, and especially something that he was so passionate and cared so much about. But he also realized the circumstances he was in. He wasn't really old enough to fight this fight very hard. And really, the church was not going to change their mind no matter what. They were in the middle of the Reformation. They were trying to, quiet any sort of rebellion or challenge against the church. And he eventually decided it was best just to apologize. Galileo was crushed. He did not want to defy his church, nor did he want to face torture, which was the usual consequence for acts of heresy. So finally, on the 4th day of questioning, Galileo declared the statement the church had prepared for him. He said, I, Galileo, son of the late Vincenzo Galileo of Florence, 70 years of age, abandon completely the false opinion that the sun is the center of the world and does not move, and the earth is not the center and moves. He said, I abandoned this completely. I'm basically saying, just kidding, I was wrong. Now, he may not have actually agreed with that, but he at least stated that publicly. The Inquisition still punished Galileo. For one thing, his statement was published in every university. You have to remember, Galileo was a pretty popular and famous teacher and scientist by then. So for everyone to see this statement basically was like public shaming him, discrediting most of his work and leading a lot of his people who had been following him their whole lives to kind of be like, what is he saying? Not only that, his book, the dialogue, the one that caused all the big problems, was banned and every copy they could find was burned. He could not publish any more books, but worst of all, he was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. So he could never leave his house. Now, I'm sure he could probably walk outside, stroll around in the garden in his backyard and things like that. But he was not allowed to go to the market, go to church, go to his friend's house, etc. Now, this is also a really sad time in Galileo's life because shortly thereafter, his beloved daughter Maria Celeste died from illness, and she was only 33 years old. His heart was broken, poor guy. For weeks, Galileo could barely sleep or eat. If you remember, he was very close to this daughter in particular, and when she passed away, it crushed him. Final years, chapter 10. Galileo spent 8 years locked inside his own house in Arcetri, and he hated it. He was a pretty social guy, and so having to be stuck in his own house without being able to leave really bothered him. There are a couple ways you could tell that it really bothered him. For one thing, he would sign his letters from my prison. So instead of like, sincerely Galileo or love Galileo, he would write from my prison, Galileo. And said he felt stricken from the pages of life. Basically, almost like he had been marked off if he didn't even exist. However, he did have guests come visit him on a regular basis, including students, family members, and friends. However, what restored his spirit the most, perhaps, was continuing his studies in science. He continued studying motion as well as the pendulum. If you remember way back in the beginning of the book, we talked about how he had studied the motion of falling objects, the speed of falling objects, lots of topics in physics, especially. But he also began here to experiment with the pendulums. If you look at this picture here on the right, this is a picture of what's commonly called a grandfather clock. But the bottom piece of the clock that swings back and forth, that is an example of a pendulum. Now, a pendulum can be really anything. It's a fixed point on something, and then the object hangs freely down from there. But basically, it kind of swings back and forth. And he used the pendulum in particular to help him invent a better clock. Until then, the best clocks were off by about even 30 minutes a day. So I'm assuming he used the timing of the pendulum, the swinging of it back and forth, to help regulate the time so it wouldn't go too fast or too slow. Galileo's last book about the physics of motion and matter was smuggled out of Italy and published in Holland in 1638. Remember, part of his punishment is he was not supposed to be publishing any more books, so this one was kind of snuck out and published in Holland. This book, called The Discourse Concerning Two New Sciences, laid new important groundwork for future scientists. Now, this is different than the dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. The dialogue is the one with the three characters that debate the geocentric and heliocentric theory. But the discourse concerning two new sciences, this one involves physics and his work with the pendulum in motion. Now, this book in particular, 50 years later, is the book that inspired Isaac Newton to discover the law of gravity, which he is a scientist that we will study starting in the next coming days. In his old age, Galileo became blind, and he died on January 8th, 1642, at the age of 78. And considering all the health troubles and things that he had gone through, 78 was a pretty long time to live. However, even after he died, his legacy lived on. Many scientists have noted how important his work is to science, including a man named Albert Einstein, pictured here on the left, who named Galileo the father of modern physics, indeed, of modern science altogether. Okay, then we have the picture of Galileo here on the right. During the 1700s, long after Galileo had passed away, the sun-centered view of the solar system slowly became accepted. More and more scientists began to agree. There was more and more evidence pointing to that, and slowly it became an acceptable view of the universe, or at least the solar system. And then by 1835, the church lifted the ban on works by Galileo and Copernicus. And then all the way forward into 1992, Pope John Paul II, who I believe is the man pictured here on the right, regretted the church's errors in regard to Galileo. He admitted that it had been wrong to turn astronomy into a matter of religion. So obviously he couldn't apologize to Galileo. It had been, hundreds of years since he had passed away, but he did publicly basically state that the church had been wrong and that they kind of, as the Catholic Church in general, they regretted the way they had handled the situation. And that it had been wrong to turn astronomy into a matter of religion. And this is just what Galileo had stated 350 years before that. Since then, history has heaped Galileo with praise. In 1989, NASA launched a spacecraft into outer space to study the planet Jupiter. Its name? The Galileo Orbiter, as you can see in the top of the picture there. So this was maybe the biggest compliment that we have given him since then, at least as far as NASA goes. But this particular shuttle that went to study the planet Jupiter, they named after Galileo, the Galileo Orbiter. So now you're going to move into a section of the pod where you're going to highlight the notes. These highlighted notes will be used for the quiz, which will be coming up later this week. And I will have the official date in the pod for you as well.